Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, where equity fits into PLC Plus with Doug Fisher and Nancy Frey. First off, before we start, we at Corwin wish health and well-being to all of you, your families, and your communities. In times of uncertainty like this, experience has taught us that one of the best ways to combat isolation is to remain connected. So that's why there'll be no disruptions to our Monday afternoon webinar series. In fact, we're planning to extend the series through the summer months in an effort to better support you, your faculty, and your students. We're assembling that roster now, so feel free to suggest via the chat box topics that you'd like to see in an upcoming session. We'd love to hear from you, so please put those in the chat box. Another thing, if you have questions for Doug and Nancy today, please write them in the chat box as well. Questions will be answered at the end of the webinar, so put all questions in chat. Now on to the forthcoming webinars. Next slide, please. Thank you. April 6th, Warren Berger and Elise Foster. Beautiful questions in the classroom, transforming classrooms into cultures of curiosity and inquiry. April 20th, Julie Stern, Visible Learning for Social Studies, Designing Student Learning for Conceptual Understanding. And then May 4th, Beth McCord-Cobet and Karen S. Karp, Strength-Based Mathematics Instruction, 5 Teaching Turnarounds for K through 6. Now, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Karina Round, Executive Marketing Manager for Corwin, to introduce today's presenters.
Thank you, Jeff. I have the pleasure of introducing our 2 speakers this afternoon. Douglas Fisher, PhD, is a professor of educational leadership at San Diego State University and a leader at Health Science High and Middle College. He has served as a teacher, language development specialist, administrator in public schools and nonprofit organizations, including 8 years as a director of professional development for City Heights Collaborative, a time of increased student achievement in some of San Diego's urban schools. Doug has engaged in professional learning communities for several decades, building teams that design and implement systems to impact teaching and learning. He has published numerous books on teaching and learning, such as Assessment Capable Visible Learners and Engagement by Design. Nancy Frey, PhD, is a professor of educational leadership at San Diego State University and a leader at Health Science High and Middle College. She has been a special education teacher, reading specialist, and administrator in public schools. Nancy has engaged in professional learning communities as a member in designing school-wide systems to improve teaching and learning for all students. She has published numerous books, including Teacher Clarity Playbook and Rigorous Reading. Because Doug and Nancy have such unique experiences as teachers and leaders, they were chosen to lead a hand-selected group of educators that came together to create the PLC Plus framework. The PLC Plus framework will provide educators with a refreshed and reinvigorated model for professional learning communities. This afternoon's webinar will focus on the PLC Plus structure's cross-cutting value of equity, which marries concept with action to change the trajectory of student learning. We're also very excited to give away a newly released On Your Feet guide, Understanding PLC Plus, to 10 lucky attendees. This guide provides a quick reference for developing strong and effective PLCs through the Plus, which is you, the teacher. Supporting you is the goal as you build your individual and collective efficacy, hold high expectations for all students, ensure equity, and ultimately guide learning for students and for your colleagues. We will be selecting people at random who participate in the chat and announcing the winners at the end of the webinar. Now I'll turn it over to Doug and Nancy.
So you all heard that, right? 10 of you are going to get these new On Your Feet guides, but only if you participate in the chat. And Nancy's watching you very carefully right now. So welcome. Nancy and I are thrilled to be here, especially in this interesting time. So we're not actually with our colleagues right now, but we're having some virtual conversations. And in fact, Thursday, we're having our next team meeting with our team. So we're still working on this together. Our website is up there, fisherandfry.com. I put my Twitter up here if you want to follow me, dfisherstsu. Nancy's Twitter will be in the chat any minute now if you want to follow Nancy. So several years ago, we wrote this sentence, and we're really proud of this sentence. Every student deserves a great teacher, not by chance, but by design. And as we wrote that sentence, we were thinking about all the possibilities that it raised, that every single kid deserves the best that we know how to offer. And not because they're lucky and they live in one zip code versus another, or not because they're lucky they went to that third grade classroom or another, but that every single kid, and that we designed amazing experiences for students that had their learning at heart. As a reminder, professional learning communities have been around since the 70s. It is not a new thing. It's been around for a while. It was introduced in the 70s, and I think it gets refined and updated. As a profession, we keep learning more and more and more. In fact, I think some of the things from the 70s are still with us, but not everything from the 70s belongs today. Some things have endured, some things have not. So things change, things revise, and we get better. We keep learning more from the experiences that we have.
We know that professional learning communities are a great structure to be able to have those important conversations that make schooling better for students, for teachers, and for communities. And in fact, and we really like this quote, that when a professional learning community is effective, it does have that capacity to be able to promote, to be able to sustain the learning of everybody that's in the school, the adults and the children, and really rallying around this collective purpose. However, we also know too that in practice, PLCs don't always live up to their promise. Sometimes, even though the structures may be there, we may have difficulty in really realizing what that promise is. Doug and I both like to say that just because it's a round table doesn't mean that it's a PLC. It really has to do with what it is that the adults are able to accomplish together. And it's important to note that these are well-meaning adults. People are there for all of the right reasons, but sometimes the ways in which we work together have proven to be less effective. And our intention has been especially to be able to really look at how it is that we can improve all of that. I'd like to invite you in the chat to be able to just talk about, for you, what are your one or two reasons that you see for a lack of PLC impact despite its promise? Time and lack of trust, lack of norms, lack of protocols. Too many definitions, Cecily, I really appreciate that. Not consulting teachers for ideas. Judging by how very quickly the chat is going by, it's almost difficult to even be able to keep up with everything that all of you are saying collectively. Lots of us have had experience in being in PLCs. Again, as I said, often surrounded by people who are very well-intentioned, but because of the structures, because of the time, the protocols, and so on, those things may be getting in the way. What we wanted to do was really look at how it was that we could develop professional learning communities, going back to Shirley Hord's definition of professional learning communities, and make them stronger, better, and faster. And for Doug and myself, we both work at a school where we have the opportunity to take an existing PLC structure and be able to lift it, to be able to elevate it, so that we would be able to improve what it is that looks like, and make us, as I said, stronger, better, and faster all along the way. And for us, an important part of that, one of you mentioned this early on, is a lack of norms. For us at our school, a place that we came to initially was in thinking about what our norms would be. And by the way, we return to these all the time. That for us in a PLC plus structure, student learning is always the focus, and it does require that collective effort. We have to stick with the data and what it is that the data tell us, even when those facts are difficult to hear, so that we can act upon them. And especially an understanding always that we need each other in order to be able to truly address the needs of everyone.
I was visiting a school, and this was up in their room where the team was meeting. The most valuable resource that all teachers have is each other. Without collaboration, our growth is limited to our own perspective. And again, that's the potential. That's what we're trying to accomplish with these professional learning communities. We've got to get people realizing that without our collaboration, without interacting with other people, we become very limited to our own thinking around kids and their achievement and their progress. Our time together today, we hope you are going to help us think about the way we organize this PLC Plus framework. It's 5 driving questions and 4 cross-cutting values, one of which is equity. And we're going to spend some time on that. And I hope by the end of the session, you can identify the needs in your current PLC, whether it's virtual or when you go back to school, and that you can identify strengths and growth opportunities for those PLCs.
And as Doug noted, there are several things that set the PLC Plus apart, and we center values really at being at the heart of this, particularly this idea of equity in action, not just simply equity as being something that we talk about.
I'm putting the poster back up because people want it. Hold on. Grab a picture.
It is a great one. I agree.
And here we go.
The 4 cross-cutting values that we have are being activators, high expectations, individual and collective efficacy, and equity. And we'll talk about each of these in a little bit more detail, but understand that within each of the protocols that are in the PLC Plus framework, these 4 cross-cutting values come back again and again. I'll start with that first one of being an activator and talk just very briefly about what it is that we mean by being an activator. So when we talk about activators, what we found in our experience with professional learning communities is that sometimes there is this notion that there must be a particular person with a particular job description that is present at all of those meetings in order to be able to make things go forward. In fact, I often hear the word facilitator being utilized for that. And unfortunately, when that responsibility rests on one individual, it becomes very difficult to have much in the way of any kind of forward notion. When we talk about activators, what we mean is that every member of that professional learning community has the potential to be able to spark the movement forward. And what we've baked into each of those protocols are ways in which anybody can serve as an activator at any time. It isn't necessarily predicated on how many years of experience that you've had or how long that you've been at a particular site or what the job title is. We want to be able to equip professional learning communities with the ability to be able to activate, to be able to spark their own learning and not have to wait for a particular person to arrive in the room.
Having said that, activators need to have a skill set. You got to know how to deal with difficult people. Several of you talked about difficult people in your comments about why PLCs are not working. You have to have tools to help people reach consensus. You have to have redirection skills. So there's a skill set that activators have that they need to be taught. And I didn't go to school. I mean, I went to school to be a teacher. So I had to learn how to be an activator. And I'm not a facilitator because I add my own thinking to the group when I'm activating. In addition, we have a value of how we have high expectations for students, that when we meet, and this comes across also in equity, when we meet, we make sure that we have high expectations for all students in our class. So, and I like to say it this way: a group of 5th grade teachers meeting to plan a lesson on 3rd grade standards will produce really good 6th graders but they are ready for 4th grade. It's not enough. We have to make sure we have high expectations for all of our students. Now, one of the tools we've designed that's in the PLC playbook is around how you analyze assignments. We'll come back to that point again, but looking around what tasks we're giving kids is super important. You've all heard of the word rigor. It's a popular word in education, rigor, rigor, rigor. Most people don't really have a definition of rigor. So I'll give you our definition of rigor when it comes to the tasks we give students. Our definition is that rigor is both difficulty and complexity. Difficulty is how much time, effort, or work you require, whereas complexity is the kind of thinking that's required. Both are important if we want to have rigor. If we just make kids do more work or have more effort, they're not going to like us or school very much. They do want more complexity to thinking. So I went online and I stole a couple items from the internet, and here's a sample state assessment item. And I would argue this item has virtually no complexity, but some students will find it difficult. It will be more difficult for 3rd graders than 10th graders. It will be more difficult for English learners than students who speak English. It never got more complex. It's just difficult for some students. Here's another item. I would argue this item has more complexity, but isn't very difficult. If you can estimate and you understand ratios and you can use process of elimination, you can get this answer right. It's more complexity to thinking, not as much difficulty. So when we were doing this work, we ran across this guy named Mark, and he's fascinated with the number pi, and he holds the record for being able to recite pi more than anybody else at 15,314 digits. The logical question is why? Why would you want to do that? But we were thinking about this person has done something pretty impressive in terms of a difficult memorization task, but it's not a complex task. And we worry that communities, parents, celebrate when their kids do things that are difficult, not always that are complex. That led us to these 4 grids. And we were thinking about how we convey rigor in tasks. How do we think about rigor? And all 4 of these are important. Some things we give students have low difficulty and low complexity. Those tasks are fluent behavior tasks, or in the research world, we call them automaticity, or in the popular press and psychology, they would call it a habit. There are some things that we ask students to do that are low difficulty, low complexity. Some of you might be taking notes right now, writing things down or taking pictures or whatever. Note-taking is a low difficulty, low complexity task for you, I assume. It doesn't mean it's an unimportant task. It's just not complex or difficult. Some tasks we give students we call stamina. We raise the difficulty, but not the complexity. We're looking for perseverance and grit and endurance. We want to make sure we raise the difficulty and not the complexity to build their stamina. But that can't be the only thing we ask kids to do. Sometimes we work on strategic thinking, being purposeful, effortful, and intentional on the kind of thinking we need. So it's more complexity, but not very difficult. And the last quadrant is where students have to struggle, where we intentionally put them in situations where they struggle. And all 4 of these quadrants are important. We're not saying that all the tasks every day, all day long, should be struggle tasks, but on a regular basis, students should struggle, and they should engage in strategic thinking. And some tasks should have stamina, and some tasks are fluent behavior. And as we've been thinking about this and putting our PLC Plus work together, we looked at this piece called the opportunity myth. There's a really interesting read for us around what students can tell us and show us about how school is letting them down or not, and how we can fix it. And one of the things in this is around the assignments that were given to students. So of the 180 hours in each core subject area during a school year, students spent 133 hours on assignments that were not grade level appropriate and only 47 hours on assignments that were appropriate. So the vast majority of the assignments students were being given were below grade level assignments. That's an important thing. That's why we built an assignment analysis into the playbook for PLC. In most PLC models, you never bring a task or an assignment to your PLC. You talk about what kids are going to learn. You talk about how you know you'll learn it. But when you go back to the classroom and you give a low-level task, they have no chance of learning it. In that same document, it talked about the green line. If students were given assignments 25% of the time that were at grade level, the trajectory is significant. From 40 months below the state average to the state average in 5 years, just with 25% of the assignments that were at grade level. And if you extrapolate that out, it won't be fixed in 1 year. But if every team that comes in contact with that kid were given reasonable amounts of time of being asked to do grade level work, the achievement gap starts to close. And that group of kids starts to perform at the state average. Also in the document, the last thing I'll point out is they talked about 4 resources that benefit all students. Teacher expectations are super important in this study. Do I expect you can do it? Then the assignments and engagement. And it turns out that instruction, when these other things were present, isn't the big differentiator. What's the big differentiator, or what the teacher expects, the level of engagement, and the kinds of assignments, grade level assignments that were given. Yeah, instruction is important, but so are our teacher expectations. And how many times do we sit around a room with our colleagues and actually talk about what we expect from our students? It's rare.
A third of those 4 cross-cutting values includes a specific call out around equity. Now, as Doug and I have both talked about, equity is really woven into all of these cross-cutting values, but it's important that we also have a place each time that a PLC Plus team gets together where we talk specifically about the actions and the decisions that we're making and how it is that they impact equitable access and conversation with our students. And many of you, of course, know many of these ideas already, certainly that equality does not equal equity. It's interesting in the last 2 weeks where conversations have become even more heightened about what it means to have access and what equity means in this particular time when students are working from home. What kinds of support are they getting? What kinds of access are they getting? And many of you have seen illustrations such as this before. This idea that that we make sure that there are unequal resources that are available for unequal needs. But I think that there are some shortcomings with this as well, because I'd like to point out that in those first 3, there are people who are still behind the fence. They're not in the game. What we really mean by equity is in making sure that everybody is in the game, that they are actually able not just to be observers, but to really be able to see and be participants in what's happening along the way. And conversations about equity are not easy conversations to have. And in particular, it's essential that we equip PLC Plus teams with tools to be able to talk about all of that, because otherwise we risk the danger of somehow suggesting that there are differences that are they biological? You know, of course they're not. And this can perpetuate this dangerous narrative that racial equity is somehow about, quote unquote, helping people of color and helping communities because they're somehow inherently or biologically deficient. And of course, that's not the case at all. We know that there's no deterministic biological basis. We know that at the same time that race is such a powerful aspect of life, and it can have life or death consequences for far too many people. And we have to find ways to be able to have these courageous conversations with one another. We can't simply allow it to somehow emerge in one way or another. We have to make sure that they happen. Several years ago, I was at a professional development with Glenn Singleton, who is another Corwin author. And Glenn challenged all of us as an audience to consider, to reflect upon how much for each of us, our lives are impacted by race. Now, I am a white woman of a certain age. And I thought to myself, well, I'd never really thought about that question before. And I decided in the spur of the moment that if I made an answer that ended either with a 0 or a 5, that somehow it would seem inauthentic. So I said 12%, very arbitrary number, 12%. And what I learned in the next couple of minutes was that I was not able to see at all that my life is impacted 100% by my race. It's just that I never bothered to really pay attention to it or to notice it. You know, there's a saying that says that the last thing a fish notices is the water that it swims in. And for me, that was a transformative experience to set me off on a journey that I am still on, that I am still learning about. But I am so fortunate that I belong to a professional learning community where those kinds of questions and questions about the actions and the decisions we make are ever present. And we've got the tools to be able to have those conversations.
If you go back to those graphics, remember the graphics that Nancy showed you, equity, inequity, the ones around equality. Even on the last graphic, I think about this all the time, even on the last graphic, the boys were watching, not playing. And what if they didn't want to play baseball, but they wanted to play soccer? But even if you take that, the difference is physical. And I think this conversation is way more complex and often threatening for people because it's not just about physical differences. It's about race, culture, and ethnicity. That's where we need to have more conversation. If we really care about equity, it can't be as reduced to as simple as, oh, put a ramp in or move the boxes around. The last value, core value we have with this is around individual and collective efficacy, that if the teams work really, really well, it should result in individual and collective efficacy, that both are important. And I saw some of the chat earlier about the collective efficacy and how long it takes, especially when they're singletons, like one person teaches one thing or only 2 people on a grade level. We'll come back to that in a few minutes. Collective efficacy is the beliefs that a group has about their ability to promote student achievement. But as John Hattie likes to say, it's more than being rah, rah, rah teachers. It's looking for evidence that you're having the impact and then making decisions. Did we do this? Did we take care of this? Did we have an effect with our students? And if you know John Hattie's work, the Visible Learning Effect Size, he now has a website. It's on the bottom of this slide, Visible Learning Meta X, where you can search for free all of the effect sizes and look at them and say, wow, what contributed to that effect size over that effect size? I think that's super awesome, by the way, that he put all of this out there for all of us to analyze and think about. And if you know the database, there are some things we do as educators that have a reverse or harmful effect. Some things that are developmental. No offense, teachers, but it had nothing you. The kid just got a year older and would have learned that without you. How embarrassing. The average teacher effect, about a half a year of learning. And then the zone of desired effect, where you get the equivalent of a year of learning for your school, where things are above average, if you will. So this 0.4 effect size is this above average effect. And collective efficacy is really strong. We like to call it an off the chart effect size. In fact, it's 2 times more powerful than feedback. It's 3 times more powerful than living in poverty, and 11 more times more powerful than putting kids in ability groups. It works to focus our efforts on collective efficacy. Now we're going to talk about a couple of things, and I'm going to come back to the point I made earlier that there's actually knowledge about that, about how a PLC team can build the collective efficacy, even if there's only 2 people on a grade level or only 3 people working in a certain area.
Another aspect that sets PLC Plus apart is the issue of teacher credibility. And Doug and I are going to spend a little bit more time on this because we also believe that this is at the heart of how it is that we ensure that students are making progress and that we are not allowing ourselves to slip into that comfort zone that says, oh, well, it must be something about the kids. Instead, with teacher credibility, what we have to do is we have to look back on how it is that we are seen as being credible in the eyes of our students. And when we are not perceived as being credible, that we understand that it is incumbent on us to be able to make those improvements, not for the children to change, but for us to be able to improve on that.
Do you remember that very first slide I showed, that our favorite quote in the world? Our favorite quote: every student deserves a great teacher. What does it mean to be a great teacher? Nancy and I have really struggled with that. We were wondering why a strategy, some instructional materials, a lesson had different impact. So why is it a team comes together and they all decide on something like reciprocal teaching, which should work, but teachers get different outcomes? Or why is it they all designed, talked about some lesson and then it got different outcomes? And our answer was around this idea of teacher credibility.
And teacher credibility, as noted previously, has a strong influence on student learning. At a 1.09, it is among the very strongest influences that there are on student learning. It's worth our time, it's worth our attention to be able to really invest in teacher credibility. And I can tell you, as a product of teacher school, nobody ever talked with me about this at all. So what does it mean to be a great teacher? When it comes to teacher credibility, there are 4 components to it. These are not components that Doug and I somehow came up with, but rather this is what the body of research says are those 4 components. And they are, as many of you noted in the chat immediately, that it is in part about trust. It's about those relationships that you have with students. And it's also about competence, about how it is that we are able to be knowledgeable about what our subject area is and to be able to convey that in effective kinds of ways. The dynamism, the passion that we bring to our subject matter and that we bring to our students. And finally, immediacy, that responsiveness, that closeness that we offer to students.
We just finished a blog post on maintaining teacher credibility in a virtual and online environment. I'm not sure when it will post on Corwin, but it should post soon. I'll try to find that out now, because all of this can be developed and maintained in a virtual environment.
I appreciated Gina's comment that kids can sniff out authenticity like nobody else can. And you're exactly right. For all of us as effective teachers, we should always be asking ourselves this question: are we credible in the eyes of our students? And I'd like to offer that that's not only students at the collective level, but it's also individual students. All of us as teachers have experienced a variance in terms of who it is that we're effective with and who it is that we're not. And rather than subscribe that to the student, that's an opportunity, that should be a growth opportunity for us to be able to look back and say, what is it that I am not yet successfully accomplishing that I can improve upon in the coming weeks, in the coming months, in order to build my credibility with that student? Because teacher credibility is always a perception. It is always in the eyes of the students. We never get to decide if we are credible. The only way that we can find out if we're credible is by looking closely at what it is that they believe that we are able to bring to the classroom. So as you noted, that first element is around trust. Trust is essential for any human relationship, whether it is in an online environment like we are right now, or whether it is in a face-to-face environment. Trust is something that as humans, we always are paying a lot of attention to. But I think it's interesting too, to dig down around what trust really means. And Megan Shannon Moran's research on trust in schools has been essential in this. In fact, I saw in the chat a little bit earlier about how it is that you can gauge trust. And Megan Shannon Moran's website has lots of tools that are on there that are free and downloadable for us to be able to use as survey instruments to find that out. Trust is not only about honesty, of course, being able to keep your word, but it's around things like benevolence. Does the student understand that you have his or her best interests at heart? That there's an openness there, that it's not my way or trailways, but that there truly is dialogue that happens in classrooms, that we're open to having that kind of dialogue with students, that we're reliable, we are true to our words. Doug likes to say that, you know, if we tell kids that they're going to have a pizza party for doing something.
I said an assembly.
Okay, an assembly. If we say to kids they're going to have an assembly for accomplishing something, we have to make sure that we follow through with that. In big ways and in small ways, we have to be reliable for our students. And there's a level of competency that's there. There's a level of confidence and comfort with what it is that we do. Another one of our colleagues, Dominique Smith, reminds us that that trusting relationship that you seek to build and maintain and repair can become damaged from time to time with students when we have difficult relationships with them. And he reminds us that we need to shift our questioning from asking what's wrong with that kid to instead asking what happened to that kid. And as he has said and others have said as well, 9 times out of 10, the story behind the misbehavior isn't what's going to make you angry. It'll break your heart. We have to find out when we have those difficult relationships with students, what it is that we can do. Because trust is always easier to gain than it is to regain. But there are times where we have to be able to regain all of that. And what that means in particular is that we listen and that we make amends. Remember that this is often a two-way street. It is not always the child that has to make the amends. Sometimes we have to make the amends, to apologize and to allow time to be able to take effect as well. A second element of that is in competence. And competence is what it is that we bring to our subject area knowledge and how it is that we ensure that students understand that quite frankly, we know what it is that we're talking about. We know our stuff. We're organized and we're confident in what it is that we do. I was fortunate enough to be in a classroom, a kindergarten classroom, not too long ago, and watching a teacher who really embodied that kind of competence. And they'd been in session for just a couple of weeks. When I went into the classroom, the teacher had already met with each of the students over the previous week to be able to develop what their writing goals were. And after they had finished a shared reading about what it was that scientists do, she was there to remind them again about what their writing goals were going to be. And in particular, as she met with each student, she noted once again what their writing goals were. And what I saw were students who had the confidence to be able to try something new because they knew that they were in the company of somebody who knew what it was that they were talking about. If you look at this particular snapshot, the teacher puts the student's writing goal up on a little sticky in the top left-hand corner. Obviously, this student's goal, Nina's goal, was to make periods. And like every good kindergartner, she made sure that we all knew that she was able to accomplish her goal by making really big, dark periods all along the way.
One of the interesting pieces about the competence research that kind of surprised us was when teachers changed their instructional strategies too frequently, the students believe we don't know what we're doing. Now, I think there's a lot of teachers out there who rapidly change their instructional strategies, kind of keeping it fresh, and they want to change it up, and it's not what students want from us. They want some level of predictability. They don't want to be bored. But I think it's an important conversation around competence, as if you change things every week, your students are going to think you don't know how to teach. The third area of teacher credibility is dynamism. The passion we bring to our classes, the ways in which we convey our love and of our subject and our teaching and our students, this being dynamic. Now, I happen to work with some teachers at our school who do dress up, and they dress up in all kinds of history stuff. Nancy and I don't dress as Edgar Allan Poe to teach ninth graders or whatever, whoever we're reading. There are all kinds of ways of being dynamic in the classroom. But the one thing that I will say on this webinar is PowerPoints are killing kids. Students want to feel us teach, not see us read. And if you haven't seen Presentations In, I recommend this book. It will change your life in how you design PowerPoints. There are so many dreadful PowerPoints that students dutifully copy verbatim where they're not paying attention to the adult talking. And we're the passionate ones about our subject. In this book, Gar Reynolds says that we can't create sliduments. You can't have a slide serve as a slide in a document at the same time. There are things we actually know that can make it better. And the last area is around immediacy or closeness. How do you get students to believe I am close to this teacher? Now that may be physically close or emotionally close. And in a large part, it's the nonverbal behaviors we convey to our students. And kids get treated differently by different teachers. We know that when you have lower expectations for students, you don't make as much eye contact, you don't stand near them very often, you don't call on them very often. But what if we said as teachers, I want your feedback too. You're gonna get feedback from me, and I'm close to you, and I want you to get feedback to me, not just from me. And I think that's an interesting change that we've seen. So welcome, please observe our class. Here's what I'm working on. Please give me feedback. I'm interested. Now we spent some time on teacher credibility because we're thinking it's one of the differentiators that doesn't get talked about enough in terms of equity. That there are teachers out there who are not credible with their students, and that's why the kids are not learning. The instructional strategies are perfectly fine, but the teacher is not credible. And we want to argue that teacher credibility powers collective efficacy. That if you're not a credible teacher, who wants you on the team? Why would a team come together and say, let's have that person, because that person's kids don't learn from that? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. So we started thinking about this and we said, we could create an axis. One axis is teacher credibility, the other one is the collective teacher efficacy. And there are some teachers who have low collective efficacy and low credibility. We call them the loners at school. And here are the characteristics of loners. The second, if you go out the credibility line and you have lots of credibility with students, but you're not very good at working with your colleagues, we call you the independent contractor. I think most principals leave this person alone because this person is good enough with the kids seem to learn stuff. What that leader doesn't realize is this person is toxic to the PLC team. The team doesn't feel good because you, this independent contractor, does these things. And I think we don't talk enough about the toxicity of an independent contractor sitting in a team meeting. I know you're all thinking in your mind, colleagues that go in each of these boxes. It's unavoidable. It happens to all of us. The next quadrant we call the talker. These people are always coming to the team meetings. They've always got a bunch of stuff to say, but their students do not learn from them. They went on teachers pay teachers and pay teachers, and they found this website and they sent it on email and they made photocopies for us. And we all look at them and we know it's just talk. They actually don't do anything with their kids. It's all show. These people don't create a toxic environment. They create a cynical environment. That if that's okay, you're allowed to just be a talker. Why am I working so hard is what starts to happen. Here are the behaviors and characteristics of talkers. And the last quadrant, teachers who have high credibility and high collective efficacy are the amplifiers. These are the people who amplify learning for their colleagues and for their students. And there's not a limited number of people who can be amplifiers in a building. We all can do this. And look at the last line, the last bullet. That students and colleagues reach their potential because of this person. And isn't that why we went into this profession? Isn't that why we do this? We want to help other people reach their potential. That's what we're trying to accomplish. These quadrants were super useful for me as I think about the interactions I have with colleagues. How much credibility do they have and how much collective efficacy do they have? How do I support them? I'll put all the definitions up so you can have them on one slide. And I find these very, very useful to help me think about what's next for this person. How do I grow this person? What are the moves we need to get this person out of the quadrant they're in up to the amplifier?
Another element or feature that's in the PLC Plus that sets it apart are the guiding questions. And these are the questions that help teams to be able to move forward. Each of these questions is meant to drive an investigation cycle of one kind or another. And the first is, where are we going? Where is it that we want to head with our students? And this is some of the fundamental work of the PLC. Where are we now? How do we assess what our current situation is? How do we move learning forward? A critical piece, and we believe a way in which the PLC Plus is different, because here's a place where we talk about instruction, here's a place where we talk about teaching. What did we learn today? That reflective element. What is it that we're noticing? Where is it that we want to head next? And then finally, who benefited and who did not from our efforts? Again, another place in which equity is a central feature of this entire cycle. So where are we going? We have a number of tools that are in the playbook, and just a couple of them include things like tools for teams to be able to analyze standards, to be able to develop learning intentions and success criteria. And as I noted in the chat, the playbook is meant to be utilized in ways that are useful for the team. If the team doesn't need to do this work, then they're doing something else. Not every team might need to analyze standards, but boy, when you've got new people that are joining your team, that's incredibly valuable to be able to do.
The second question is, where are we now? And virtually no PLC teams talk about this. We all talk about what kids are going to learn. And the challenge with that is they already know stuff. And so why aren't we talking about initial assessments? Like, what do we know that kids know already? How are we going to collect that information and assess it and modify what we're going to teach them? And then what's the challenge we have? What is it based on the data that we see of what they already know? What is our challenge for instruction? Graham Nuthall did this really interesting book, and he said somewhere, depending on the class and grade level, somewhere between 40 and 60% of instructional minutes are spent on things students have already mastered. Well, if we're doing that, we're going to run out of time. We're going to run out of time because what we're supposed to be doing is teaching in the gap between what students already know, understand, and are able to do, and what they need to know, understand, and be able to do. We run out of time because so much instruction. Oh, and I said this, by the way, it's very rewarding to teach things to students that they already know. It's pretty cool. It feels pretty amazing. It's just not helpful. We have to know what they already know. And that gap is troubling me, that teams are not encouraged to talk about how will you know what they already know so you're not redundant. The next one about moving learning forward is also avoided often in PLC meetings. We're all talking about what do we want them to learn, how do we know they learned it, what do we do if they don't learn it, those kinds of things. We know some things about moving learning forward. We have evidence-based instructional practices. We should be looking at the assignments we give kids. We should be thinking about compensatory and adaptive approaches to differentiate instruction. See, when I went to school, I learned that it takes curriculum and instruction and assessment to cause learning. All three are important. And most PLCs never talk about instruction because they were told not to. And I worry that we're going to only talk about instruction. I don't think that's the right thing. But instruction is linked to learning. If we think that instruction causes learning, we should share with our teams. And I was in a team meeting several years ago. It was a third grade class. We were all talking about reading comprehension, and then everyone's going to go back and do their own thing. But one teacher said, kind of in passing, yeah, I think round robin would really work well to close the comprehension gap. And all the rest of us were shocked. And we talked about why that wouldn't work, where the evidence was, the lack of evidence that that would even do anything. And if that teacher had not said that, that team meeting would have ended, and that teacher would have gone back and done round robin with her students and had no impact on learning. It wasn't that she was a terrible teacher, it wasn't that she was trying to cause harm. That's all she knew at the time, because her team never talked about what do we know about moving learning forward by talking about instruction.
A fourth question is, what did we learn today? How are we as an organization learning from one another? And a couple of tools that we have available include things like expert noticing. What is it that actually looks like? How is it that we support one another in our classrooms? The development of common assessments, as well as being able to determine impact. I'll come back to determining impact for just a moment. Another tool that we offer within that expert noticing is micro-teaching, another one of those powerful influences at a 0.88 for student learning. How is it that we talk about our own practices with one another? When it comes to in particular, how it is that we determine our impact, it means that we have to get stronger in being able to check for understanding, to be able to be knowledgeable about not only how it is that we check for understanding, but how it is that we share that information with our colleagues as well. Another tool that's available in terms of determining impact is, oh, there you go. Sorry. Sorry, a little fumble there.
So the last question that we use in our cycles, and we don't have one meeting to talk about one question. It's there in a conversation, the questions come and go. So it's, we don't say, okay, on this week, we're going to talk about where are we going, and next week, where are we at now? They're more fluid than that. But this question forces the equity conversation. Now, all of them, I would argue, have an equity lens to them. Where are we going? What do we want kids to learn? Do we actually teach them grade level stuff? What do we know now? How do we move learning? All of it have an equity lens to them, but this one forces it. In fact, to our thinking on this last question, you have to do an equity audit. Now, I know that some people are out there implementing PLC Plus and they're skipping the 5th question, because having an equity audit conversation in your team meeting is very threatening, because we force the data by trends. And one of my reflections of being involved in this movement for many, many years is that team after team after team says, here's a kid who didn't learn it, that kid needs intervention. Here's another kid who didn't learn it, that kid needs intervention. And the rosters of students getting tier 2 and tier 3 are growing and growing and growing. And when you look at the demographics of who's getting intervention, it's pretty obvious that it's inequitable. So we have to think about that. What do we need to do to remove the barriers for some students learning? What do we need to do to increase the opportunities to learn? And yes, some students do need tier 2 and tier 3. RTI works, but it can overwhelm a system if all the kids keep going to tier 2 and tier 3. We have to talk about what we see in the data, that we caused that. It's us. What did we see in the data that we can do about it? And I just saw a thing in there about, it's about us being responsible. And so we create equity audits that say, let's look at trends. How do girls do versus boys? How do certain ethnic groups do? How do our English learners do? And not all teams do that. They focus on individual learners. One of the tools we use is this progress achievement download. It's a free download. It's a Excel file you populate. You put the student's name in. You can put the demographics in if you wish. And you put in their pre-assessment and their post-assessment, and you can see how much progress they made versus how they achieved overall. And then we can start to have conversations about, what is it about? What do we know that the students in the low quadrant have in common? And what are we doing about it? It's our responsibility, and we take ownership for it. So it's no longer around Lydia and Justin and Daniel and Christos having intervention. It's about what the trends are and how do I remove barriers for their learning. With that, we're gonna pause for some questions. We're running low on time, but I think there were some questions coming up.
Yeah, there were. And what I'd like to say is, why don't we answer a question or two, and then I'll send you the other questions and you can answer them later in the week when people get their video sent to them. But you know, what's an interesting question that came up is, let's see here. I want to just ask, how do we keep the teachers and students engaged as online learning is extended over the next several weeks? And if that came up a couple of times, and I can see why. So if you have any information on that, that would be great.
So I think there's several things about that, and we're all learning rapidly about this. I think it's about being present with students. I think it's about giving them good examples. So we're doing video recordings of teacher modeling, thinking aloud for them. We're trying to be assuring that without lying to students, that everything's going to be okay, because we don't know where people's families will be and what will happen long term. We talk about providing regular access to them. You know, how do we get in daily? And this is a huge inequity issue. It's like, there are kids who don't have computers at home. There are kids who don't have internet access. I mean, the rich are going to get richer and the poor are going to get poorer. And we're really struggling with that. How do we make really good learning experiences for students that chunk. We're talking about taking things apart into 15-minute segments because it's too much to, I mean, you all were here for an hour. Most of you are paying attention, but things come up in your mind and in your experiences. And we're trying to chunk stuff in there and give students shorter tasks that they can experience success with as we build their stamina. This is going to be a hard thing. This is going to be a very difficult time. And I hope we're all going to learn a lot about this, about what it takes and the kind of blended learning we will provide for students in the future. The blog post that we did on teacher credibility in an online environment, which is not about engagement and learning, but it's about being credible in the online, is going to post on, I think, next Monday, and you will make sure you get the link. It'll also be on my Twitter feed for those of you who follow me.
Terrific. Thank you. I think now would be a good time to turn it back over to Karina.
Great. Thank you so much, Doug and Nancy, for an incredible webinar. That was fantastic. So now that we are all excited on how professional learning communities can be engines for action for equitable student learning, you'll likely want to know what's next. Luckily, we have several next steps that you can consider. Next slide, please. First, you'll want to learn more about the research and the foundation for PLC Plus, which comes in the form of the PLC Plus book, the PLC Plus Playbook, a hands-on companion, and the PLC Plus Activators Guide, the essential guide that shows activators what to expect and how to navigate their PLC. All titles are available for sale at corwin.com/PLC Plus. Next slide, please. So now the winners of the On Your Feet guides are Susan Goldberry, Michael Galligan, Rosemary Bradley, Lynn Westerman, Carly York, Angelique Thomas, Christy P., Ruth de Jesus, Halia Kai, and Gina de Palermo. Thank you so much for everyone's participation in the chat today. We'll be contacting the winners via email for the mailing addresses. Also, if you're interested in picking up the PLC Plus On Your Feet guides, they're also available for purchase at corwin.com/PLC Plus books. Next slide, please. You can also see PLC Plus in action at one of our institutes. During this time, we are continuing to monitor updates from the CDC and state authorities surrounding COVID-19 guidelines and will adjust our institutes as necessary. That said, we are hopeful to host 2 or more PLC Plus institutes in the fall. If you register, you can receive $50 off registration. Next slide, please. We'll also be hosting our annual PLC Plus conference, which will be our first one in Las Vegas, January 2021. So we hope to see everyone there too.
Viva Las Vegas.
Exactly. And finally, last slide. Lastly, you can visit corwin.com/what's-next-PLC for additional resources that include an ebook, PLC Plus assessments, and other tools for learning. If you're interested in a PLC Plus needs analysis, you can contact your professional learning advisor on this page. Thank you again for your time today. You'll be receiving a follow-up email with a certificate of completion and link to the recording so that you can share this information with any of your colleagues. Also, I'd like to point out if you have any questions for Doug and Nancy, you can always send them a tweet with hashtag #AskFisherandFrey, and we'll be responsive to any tweets and questions to you. Thank you so much and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, everyone.